Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs magazine from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. This week we have a double focus for you. First, Germany after the elections. What do the results mean, and what does the future hold for Europe's largest economy? Expect political analysis and a deep dive look at economic decline in the once proud home of Volkswagen.
It's a question how to keep markets open, how to keep free trade agreements. And I think this is something where the next government has to be very clear about.
Then, Brussels, Washington and Kyiv. What might a security guarantee look like in the age of Trump? And is the price worth paying? Big questions, cautious answers. That's here on Inside Europe. Germany has voted, and the results have delivered a clear shift to the right. Not only did Friedrich Merz's Christian Democrats come top with just under 29% of the vote, but for the first time in the history of the modern Federal Republic, a far-right party, the anti-immigrant AfD, came in second place, taking some 20% of the vote nationally and significantly more than that in the states which previously made up the Soviet-aligned GDR. All three parties in the previous governing coalition were severely punished at the polls, with one party, the neoliberal FDP, being voted out of parliament altogether. The economically left-wing but socially conservative Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht also narrowly missed the 5% hurdle necessary for entry into parliament. In contrast, the left-wing Die Linke party defied initial predictions, achieving almost 9% of the vote on the back of an explicitly anti-racist campaign which highlighted social issues such as the cost of living and rent prices. So, what does all this mean for Germany? DW's political correspondent, Thomas Sparrow, was on hand to give me his analysis.
One important conclusion is Germans voted for change. And the second important conclusion that I would say, but again, this one with a little caveat, is that Germany is shifting to the right. Not only because the conservative bloc CDU, CSU won the election, although they had actually hoped for a better result than what they actually got. Also, the AfD, the far-right alternative for Germany, got their best result so far, doubling what they got in 2021. The little caveat there is that on the other side of the political spectrum, you also have the left party that many had actually thought in advance that they wouldn't even be in parliament. They managed a good result and they will be in parliament with around 8% of the vote. That's a very good result for them, a surprising one. And the strategy behind that vote was basically to attract young voters in Germany. So the country may be shifting to the right, but there's that caveat that the left party that many had thought wouldn't even manage to enter the federal parliament actually did quite well.
Let us talk about coalition possibilities. This may be a fairly short conversation because we're actually only left with two. Is that right?
Basically, yes. So mathematically, there are other possibilities. Realistically and politically, the most likely coalition that we will be seeing is what you in the past called the Große Koalition, the Grand Coalition. And I said in the past, because obviously you can't call it now a Grand Coalition. It was normally called like that because it meant that the coalition was between the two biggest parties in parliament, or the two biggest groups in parliament, namely the Conservative Bloc and the Social Democrats. But given the bad state of the Social Democrats and the fact that they're now in third position, then there are already discussions that you cannot call them the Grand Coalition any longer. But it does seem to be that that will be the way in which German politicians can guarantee a stable government. And stable, I say that very carefully. Stable, I mean with a majority in parliament. Stable, I do not think it will be when it comes to some of the discussions and some of the key political issues that the new government will have to resolve, from migration to the economy, to the war in Ukraine, to the situation and relationship with the United States under Donald Trump. That will be very, very difficult. So although Friedrich Merz has stated that he would like to have that coalition by Easter, so around April, there are many issues where the two parties, the two blocs, do not see eye to eye.
And there are a lot of wounds to be licked on the side of the SPD. Not only have they just received a historic battering at the polls, but they are also coming out of a previous government coalition bruised and frustrated by the experience. And then, of course, there is the personality of the man that they will have to do business with and call boss, Friedrich Merz of the CDU, who is known for his very, very sharp rhetoric. Even on the last day of the elections, he made a speech talking about left-wing and green Spinner. It's a sort of a German word for sort of fantasists. So this really, really hard rhetoric against the left wing at a time when the far right is, as we've seen, absolutely insurgent. He's not exactly been waving the white flag in terms of the party that he is going to have to try and form a coalition with, is he?
And that is obviously something that within the Social Democrats was met with criticism, especially among the sort of left wing within the Social Democrats. And that is, I think, something that will definitely come again as part of the negotiations. The fact that when he has that sort of rhetoric against the left wing, that will affect the possible negotiations between both parties. And that's what I actually meant as well when I was saying that there are differences between both groups, because one important element there that could make things even more complicated is that normally the Social Democrats obviously want party members to also have a say in any kind of coalition agreement, and that is not something that is A, easy, or B, quick.
Yeah, and both parties will be conscious, the CDU will be conscious that it has hemorrhaged voters to the AfD on its right, and the SPD will be conscious that this time it actually hemorrhaged voters to Die Linke on its left. So there are forces pulling both away from the middle, and it is the middle ground right now that needs to be occupied.
It is the middle ground that needs to be occupied, that's for sure, and it'll be very interesting actually from a, let's say, journalistic, political perspective to see how everything develops in the next few days, possibly in the next few weeks, and what kind of strategy these different parties will present to, on the one hand, find that middle ground, on the other hand, still stick to their core principles and beliefs.
Let's come to the AfD. Now the second force in Parliament in terms of parliamentary seats. That is a major historic change. That has never been the case before. What is coming at us in terms of this new, rejuvenated, boisterous AfD bloc in Parliament?
Well, it will make any kind of political discussion and political agreement more difficult, because essentially the other parties will have to find ways of discussing and agreeing things without a fifth of the electorate. A fifth of the electorate basically disagrees with what the Conservative bloc is doing, what the Social Democrats is doing, what the Greens are doing, and so on. So that's one sort of important element. The second element, I think, is the AfD will be much louder in terms of their requests and in terms of their political ideas. And one of the ways in which they're already, and I already see that happening, is that they're calling for this Brandmauer to end. So basically that firewall that has been in place for many decades that determines that other parties cannot cooperate with a far-right party. Well, the AfD is saying you can't ignore what 1/5 of German voters are saying, and 1/5 of German voters would want the AfD to have more political responsibility.
Fifth of the population in the states that made up former East Germany, it's a lot higher than that. We're looking at figures of over 40%.
Well, yes, and if you can imagine a map of Germany, you would have the eastern part of Germany colored light blue, so the color of the AfD, and the western part of Germany colored black, so the color of the Conservative bloc. And this just shows you again, with a very sort of clear map, how divided the country is when it comes to their political support. That map is the different constituencies. So if you zoom in, then you would have particular cities where the left party got a majority of the share, or at least a good part of the share, or where the Social Democrats actually managed to do well. But if you sort of zoom out and look at the map, then you would have the blue AfD on the one side and the black CDU-CSU on the other side of the map. And the eastern part of Germany has been the AfD's stronghold. And again, this will be a challenge for the other parties as well.
Well, Thomas, thank you so much for being my guide once again.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure, remotely and also in person here in Berlin.
If we just go back to that image of the map of Germany, the one with the former East German states painted in the blue of the AfD and the former West German states painted in the black of the Christian Democrats. Well, just on the western side of that border, in the state of Lower Saxony, there is a town known as the Autostadt, or Car City. This is Wolfsburg, home of the German car giant Volkswagen. And its fortunes are symbolic for the wider economic crisis facing Germany, a crisis which the next government will need to solve or risk the AfD's regional majorities spilling over and colouring the whole of that map blue. Our reporter Natalie Carney boarded a train, destination Wolfsburg.
As a journalist, I've seen many of Germany's ailing railway stations, but pulling into Wolfsburg Hauptbahnhof felt different. The station is dwarfed by the 4 towering red brick chimneys of the iconic Volkswagen plant just across the Mittelland Canal. The entire city of Wolfsburg, between Berlin and Hanover, was specifically built to accommodate the first factories supporting businesses and all their employees. Even today, wages here are the highest in the country. Volkswagen was founded in 1937 by Germany's Nazi government to mass produce a low-priced people's car. The manufacturer quickly grew into the country's largest automaker and one of the main driving forces behind its post-war reconstruction, employing hundreds of thousands of people while offering a sense of pride for generations of Germans following the anguish of World War II. However, times have certainly changed, and today, Volkswagen has become a symbol of what's gone wrong with Germany's economic model.
Hello, Mr. Thompson.
I'm meeting with Professor of Economics at the University of Hanover, Dr. Stefan Thompson, to find out why. Ironically, his office sits in the former administrative headquarters of the automotive supplier Continental.
I think there are a couple of challenges. One is the technological transformation, that we have this new technology, the EV cars, to get carbon neutrality, which is a high aim, a global aim for many countries. And that German car producers were not able to be at the forefront of these products.
Many have blamed German automakers for being asleep at the wheel as China revolutionized the industry at full speed, pioneering the electric vehicle to become the world's largest automotive manufacturing country.
With this shift from combustion to electric vehicles, the German cars lagged behind. If you think like 15, 20 years back, when hybrid cars were introduced, Germans were hesitant to do this, and they were still at the combustion engines, and they were very good at it.
Good or not, demand declined amidst a global push towards green mobility. An EU ban on new fossil fuel cars coming in 2035 has made combustion engines very unattractive, while soaring energy prices are significantly increasing production costs. And any federal measures to promote the production and sale of EVs was cancelled last year due to budget cuts. Analysts are also concerned about the possibility of a trade war with China after the EU imposed tariffs on the import of their EVs.
Particularly for an economy like the German one, where 75-76% of cars are for the export, tariffs are a bad signal, because these cars become much more expensive, and maybe the demand will even more decline.
All of this is dragging down German auto manufacturing and, in turn, taking the German economy with it. After 2 straight years of economic decline, it's heading for a third, says Thompson.
The German automakers have been the backbone of German industrial production for many years. So, and within the share of the GDP, it's like 20 to 30%.
Volkswagen.
With debt well over $200 billion, Volkswagen has been particularly affected by these challenges. Last year, management announced plans to reduce wages, lay off workers, and potentially close factories in an effort to stay competitive, a first in the company's 87-year history. In response, more than 100,000 staff at 9 plants across the country laid down tools in the largest strikes ever seen at the carmaker. Weeks of bitter negotiations finally produced a deal, but one that will still see the auto giant slash 35,000 jobs by 2030 to drastically reduce costs. Back on the streets of Wolfsburg, concern is palpable. This retired auto worker, who did not want to give his name, says VW still runs through his veins. Another Wolfsburg resident told me that the situation is still very tense.
Keiner weiß so richtig, wo die Reise hingeht.
No one knows where this journey will take us to, and as a contract worker, we'll probably be the first who will have to leave. It will be difficult to find an adequate job with this kind of salary, which secures our existence.
Die uns eben die Existenz sichert.
And that leads us to the next big problem. Germany's economic model has long relied on industry, but in addition to automotive, the country's steel production is also seeing sharp decline due to weak demand, high electricity prices, and decarbonation costs. Finding robust economic alternatives to fill the void in Germany's GDP will be difficult, says Thompson.
As an economist, we have to make enough revenue and then we have to have profit. And so we are quite costly location. The production side in Germany is much too expensive compared to other nations. So if you go in with a different industry, try to make a startup, you have to have the same ability to pay these high prices that people expect. But this will be a very hard transition because from the mindset, we are an auto nation still.
Reviving the country's economy was a main theme on the campaign trail ahead of recent federal elections. Outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called for Europe-wide sale incentives for electric cars. His Social Democratic Party also support the introduction of a transformation fund to help promote German EVs through tax breaks. Meanwhile, the Christian Democrats plan to reduce electricity prices by lowering grid charges and is considering lifting that ban on fossil fuel cars from 2035. All of this points towards a desire to keep the automotive industry alive, even if Germany is no longer in pole position. But politicians need to provide a detailed, transparent plan of how to do that, says automotive professor Frank Schwuppe.
The most important thing is a solid framework. You simply need clear guidelines for electromobility today and not for combustion engines tomorrow. It's important that politics provides a stable framework.
This includes trade regulations too, adds Thompson.
It's a question how to keep markets open, how to keep free trade agreements. And I think this is something where the next government has to be very clear about.
As I leave Wolfsburg with my new laptop, latest smartphone, and high-end digital sound recorder, all made abroad, I am reminded of the times. New technology and competition is surpassing Germany's aging industries, emphasizing the urgency for pragmatic and innovative policies from the country's next government. Otherwise, as the election results make clear, the far right is waiting in the wings, not necessarily with solutions, but with scapegoats. Natalie Carney, DW, Wolfsburg.
The success of Germany's future government is not just of critical concern domestically, but internationally as well. Put simply, these are not times in which Europe can afford a power vacuum at its centre. So, to Brussels next, with one eye on Washington. That's with me, Kate Laycock, here on Inside Europe.
Hey everybody, I'm Kai Ryssdal, the host of Marketplace, your daily download on the economy. Money influences so much of what we do and how we live. That's why it's essential to understand how this economy works. At Marketplace, we break down everything from inflation and student loans to the future of AI so that you can understand what it all means for you. Marketplace is your secret weapon for understanding this economy. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
European leaders are struggling to figure out how their relationship with the United States under Donald Trump will evolve, reading each remark the president makes for meaning. This week, Terry Schultz takes a turn at reading the tea leaves to try and understand the implications for assistance to Ukraine and European security.
Each day, European leaders must try to interpret whether the latest remarks from the White House are insults or injuries, neither or both. Here, for example, is how Donald Trump explains why he's going to impose 25% tariffs at some point soon on European imports.
They've really taken advantage of us in a different way. They don't accept our cars. They don't accept essentially our farm products. They use all sorts of reasons why not. And we have about a $300 billion deficit with the European Union. Now, I love the countries of Europe. I guess I'm from there at some point a long time ago, right? But indirectly. pretty directly too, I guess. But I love the countries of Europe. I love all countries, frankly, all different. But European Union's it was formed in order to screw the United States. I mean, look, let's be honest. The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it.
That, of course, is not why European countries started to integrate with the steel and coal community in 1952. It was to provide the benefits of a larger economy, which evolved into today's 27-member European Union. In addition, Trump was asked at this same press conference about plans for monitoring an eventual ceasefire he says he'll broker between Ukraine and Russia. Trump has demanded that European forces be sent into Ukraine for that, and the few European allies which say they might participate have conditioned it on American support in the form of jets stationed nearby, which could respond quickly if Russia were to attack European soldiers. French President Emmanuel Macron made this case Monday in meetings with Trump, and the same day, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas insisted Europeans be invited to negotiations the U.S. is holding with Russia, discussing potential European involvement without them.
You can discuss whatever you want with Putin, but if it comes to Europe or Ukraine, then Ukraine and Europe also have to agree to this deal.
Kallas also criticized Trump's description of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, quipping that she thought Trump must have gotten Zelensky mixed up with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Coincidentally or not, when Kallas arrived in the U.S. on Tuesday for a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, she learned that would no longer be happening. The State Department said Rubio suddenly had a scheduling difficulty. But back at the White House on Wednesday, and Trump being asked about U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine.
Well, I'm not going to make security guarantees beyond very much. We're going to have Europe do that because it's we're talking about Europe as their next door neighbor. But we're going to make sure everything goes well.
From that phrase, we're going to make sure everything goes well, European leaders will be hoping Trump is willing to provide that American backstop for a European force, but it hasn't been publicly confirmed. If that were to happen, Carnegie Endowment's Michael Kaufman believes Europe could manage to pull together the force without too much trouble. Kaufman was just in Ukraine, researching the military situation there.
European militaries could deploy a limited ground force, something on the equivalent of 3 brigades, maybe about 15,000 troops. They need about 3 times that, perhaps, for rotation, so a total of 40 to 50,000 personnel allocated to this. This is within the means of current European militaries.
But there are many prominent voices expressing dismay that these discussions are taking up so much time and energy, rather than efforts to help Ukraine win the war. Among them is retired Estonian General Riho Terras, who is a member of the European Parliament. He genuinely didn't even want to talk to me about this idea of a peacekeeping force.
I don't think that makes any sense. So let us stop talking about what is after. We need to talk about how we come to the peace on the Ukrainian terms. And from there on, we will think, how can we assure the Ukraine the security? It might be NATO membership. It might be troops on the ground in Ukraine. But today, we need to win the war.
Unfortunately for pro-Ukraine Europeans, there's no sign yet that taking Kyiv's side over Moscow's will ever get full backing from the Trump administration. But perhaps in this case, the almost daily fluctuations in the president's rhetoric may be a reason for hope. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer meets Trump Thursday, the next in line to try to wield influence on behalf of European allies. Terry Schultz, DW, Brussels.
Just a little note here. This piece was recorded on Thursday, so that's a day ahead of Volodymyr Zelensky's scheduled visit to Washington. For the latest developments from a European perspective, see DW's news pages or download the Breaking News app. Alternatively, you could also follow Terry Schultz on socials. That's Terry with an I and Schultz with a T. I'm Kate Laycock. I'm not going to spell that one for you. And you're listening to Inside Europe. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. Ukraine and the war of defence that it has now been fighting for 3 long years are our main focus for the next half hour. Last week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky broke an unwritten taboo amongst international leaders. He publicly stated that Donald Trump is living in a disinformation space created by Russia. So, what are the contours of that disinformation space, and what is the reality that it obscures? It's an important question because it forms the information context in which any potential deals involving Washington will be made. I didn't have to look very hard to find the answers. A brief scroll through the social media posts of Donald Trump, Elon Musk and related handles gave a pretty clear picture. And I also made use of a fact sheet produced by the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War. So, myths in hand, I asked DW's Kyiv correspondent Nick Connolly to help me deconstruct them. First on the list, what I'm calling the all is lost myth. It goes something like this. Most Ukrainian cities have been destroyed, Ukraine has suffered millions of losses, and Zelensky risks losing all of Ukraine.
Well, exactly. That is something we hear a lot from Donald Trump about all the cities lying in ruins, and I'm sitting right now in the centre of Kyiv and can't see any ruins around me. Obviously, if you go close towards the front lines, places like Kharkiv or Dnipro, you do see more destroyed buildings, but these are still functional European cities with better mobile internet than you'll find in Germany or most of Western Europe, with better logistics. You've got postal service. You can send packages late afternoon here from Kyiv to the front lines and they'll be there the next morning. I even know people whose relatives are fighting who send them food parcels with cooked meals, expecting for them to arrive the next day. Obviously, this country has suffered hugely in terms of military losses. The kind of ballpark figure that most experts talk about is about 80,000. That hasn't been approved or confirmed by the government. Zelensky still talks about ballpark 40,000 military deaths. The UN talks about 12, 13,000 civilian casualties, obviously more wounded in both cases. It is a huge impact on this country. Millions of people have left for safety in Western Europe. But this is a country that is still functioning, thanks in part to Western aid, financial aid. But I think there are still resources here, and there isn't the sense here in Ukraine that the country is about to collapse and has to accept any deal at any cost.
Thank you. Right, that brings us to myth number 2. I'm calling this the Zelensky is a dictator myth. In recent days, Donald Trump has called Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator without elections in a post on Truth Social. So the claim here is that free elections are being suppressed in Ukraine. There's also an additional related claim that Donald Trump has made, and that is that Volodymyr Zelensky has approval ratings of 4%.
So the Ukrainian constitution doesn't allow holding elections during wartime. That is just not something that, as long as you are at war in this kind of special legal regime with all the things that go with it, elections are not allowed. That's the first thing. And secondly, even Zelensky's critics, who are very vocal and very outspoken, are not pushing for elections right now. They are painfully aware of the kind of division and introspection that could bring. That is not what this country would need to carry on fighting. So you just don't hear it from people. There are lots of people who are very frustrated with Zelensky, who think that his kind of Churchillian role at the beginning of the war has gone to his head. But even those people, I have yet to hear people saying that they think they need elections right away. In terms of his poll ratings, they're obviously very different polling companies and different levels of kind of credibility. But on average, they come out about 40, 50%, depending on how you ask the question, some more. So it is definitely not 4%.
Myth number 3, I'm calling the money sink myth. The myth goes something like this. Ukraine's resistance is being funded predominantly by the US. Europeans are only providing money as loans. Ukraine has misused or lost half of the aid that it has received.
So in terms of aid, especially at the beginning of the war, it was divided up largely that the Americans were giving more military aid and the Europeans were giving cash to basically keep the lights on here, to pay wages, to pay pensions, allowing the Ukrainian government to spend everything that it was making in taxes on the army and everything else. Hospitals, teachers, pensions were all being paid for with European cash. It is very complex because there are so many different channels of funding, European countries directly through the EU. Usually the kind of best figures are from the Kiel Institute, that's a kind of economics in Germany that has a Ukraine aid tracker. And for a long time, US and Europe were kind of largely similar in terms of overall help. Now it seems like Europe is definitely pulling ahead and giving more, and this is also aid, not loans. There's talk of moving towards more loans as there is from the US, but so far this has all predominantly been aid that doesn't have to be repaid.
Myth number 4 is the Ukraine's to blame myth. Recently, when challenged about why Ukrainian officials weren't invited to talks held in Saudi Arabia with Russia, Trump said, well, you shouldn't have started it.
Yeah. When people say that Ukraine is to blame because Ukraine was talking about joining NATO, they totally ignore the fact of why Ukraine and Poland and the Baltic states have wanted to join NATO. The Americans weren't particularly keen, weren't pushing hard for NATO enlargement to the east in the 90s, 2000s. It was these countries that saw that Russia hadn't dealt with its Soviet past, hadn't decided that annexing neighboring countries was a problem, was an issue, was something that shouldn't be repeated. And so they were pushing very hard for these guarantees. We see, even though, for instance, Finland, which is very close to St. Petersburg, Russia's second city, Vladimir Putin's hometown, the Russians aren't scared of a NATO invasion from Finland. They have barely moved large numbers of equipment to that border. The thing that NATO membership for Ukraine would do would prevent Russia from invading Ukraine again. It would prevent Russia from basically recolonizing Ukraine. And that is why they are so vehemently against a NATO membership for Ukraine. There is no sense in which Ukraine was threatening Russia. Russia had annexed Crimea, had sent its proxies into Donbass in 2014. And there was no sense in 2022 either that NATO membership for Ukraine was even that close or likely, or that any other kind of threat for Russia was going to emerge here in Kyiv. This is about Vladimir Putin's kind of fixed idea, his kind of obsession with the fact that in his mind, Ukraine is a fake country, a project created by the West to kind of take these lands and these people away from Russian control. And he sees it as his historical mission to right that wrong as he sees it and to basically recolonize Ukraine.
Nick, I'm going to be honest with you. This is not the conversation that I wanted to be having with you this week as we mark 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If we zoom out away from all this noise, what do you think the real stories are that we should be telling and marking this week?
I'm not sure that it feels like a real change, right? I think those anniversaries in a way are more important for people outside the country who obviously are distracted by their own kind of day-to-day politics and other things to come back to Ukraine. But certainly I have had lots of conversations with friends looking at their photo albums on their phones, looking at their selfies from the days before the war or the early days of the war, and had to face the fact that all of us here have aged more than 3 years over these years of war. There is a tiredness, there is an exhaustion, but there is also a resilience. I think there is something that I've really been noticing over the past few weeks with friends in Western Europe really freaking out about all the noise coming out of Washington, as you put it, the kind of big announcements, the basic rejection of transatlantic solidarity and kind of security arrangements. And here in Ukraine, people see it, they read it, they are worried, but they don't have the same energy to be freaked out, to be scared, because they are already facing the risk every day. It might not be so huge, but here in Kyiv, you've got Russian drones flying over rooftops every night, people dying, as just happened last night. And so there is a kind of stubborn resilience and a kind of awareness that we've made it this far. It is scary, it is tiring. Obviously, people want this to be over, but they know that they can do it and they can somehow get through all this. And the kind of thing you hear time and time again is, yes, we want peace, yes, we want a deal, but we don't want a deal at any price that'll just delay or just put off Vladimir Putin maybe by a year or two, and then he'll come back with a refreshed army and kind of recovered economy to finish the job. And next time around, maybe the West will be more distracted and won't have the same kind of response as was the case under the Biden administration in 2022. So, Ukraine is sticking to its guns on that, is not, for now at least, signing up to any kind of quick Trump deal to end this war or to pause it and to allow America and also Europe to basically wash its hands of Ukraine. And I think they're seeing that, if they hold their nerve, they might be able to get a bit more out of Trump than was initially suspected.
DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
DW's Nick Connolly there. grief and resilience. That was also very much the mood at a ceremony in Madrid on Monday, during which Ukrainians in exile marked the third-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion and the unveiling of a memorial sculpture to fallen Ukrainian soldiers, the first of its kind in Spain. Inside Europe's Ashish Sharma attended the event in the town of Torrejón de Ardoz, just outside of Madrid.
Que este monumento sea un recordatorio de nuestra promesa de seguir luchando por la paz.
At a somber gathering in the gardens of the cultural centre El Parque, locals gathered to mark the start of a ceremony to not only remember those who've lost their lives since the Russian onslaught, but also to not forget that the war is still ongoing. The unveiling of a sculpture with an emblematic dove of peace flying off from one side of the artwork was a collaboration between the local government and the organisation called the Association of Ukrainians of Torrejón de Ardoz. Also in attendance was Sergei Ustimenko, Councillor Minister of the Ukrainian Embassy here in Spain.
We are really grateful to Spanish people who support Ukrainians living in Spain. There is no victory without the consolidated support and position of our partners.
So how special is this occasion today? We've just had an inauguration of a wonderful statue with a dove of peace as a symbol of peace and friendship.
You know, these people are Ukrainians and they are constantly contributing in accumulating money for emergencies for Ukrainians living in Ukraine. For them, Ukraine as the motherland, and this sense of common motherland, it keeps them doing good things and supporting Ukrainians in Ukraine. And many families living right now in Spain, they have their husbands, their brothers and fathers in Ukraine fighting for our independence, for our territory. These figures, these signals in monuments, they are supporting the memory of those who has given their life for independence for our country.
There are more than 200 Ukrainian families that live in this town. The community was established long before the war broke out, and because of their strong links with Ukraine, this community has done more than most to help with relief aid, as well as bring over Ukrainian refugees fleeing the fighting. Oksana Samak is the head of the association.
Here, the government has given out a lot of help. We have sent out 4 full trailers of humanitarian aid. People here have donated more than 100,000 euros, with which we were able to buy surgical equipment for hospitals. We opened an indoor center for young children who came here as refugees, and where they have Spanish classes. Every person that has come here has been given a check of almost 300 euros to help them buy food.
Spain has been one of the most supportive European countries for Ukraine, not so much in military terms, but more in humanitarian aid.
Alejandro Navarro, the mayor of Torrejón de Ardoz. In Torrejón de Ardoz, we do everything to help the people of Ukraine. We started this sculpture, but I think we can do many things to help these people. It's a difficult moment, no? It's a difficult moment for the government. The politics for the United States is changed everything in every moment, no? And it's difficult for the government to Spain, but I think we do it anymore.
Given the recent communication between the US President Donald Trump and Russia's leader Vladimir Putin, there is growing concern in the Ukrainian government about what help the country will receive while Russia carries on with its aggression.
It's a very crucial period of our history. We are not talking only about the military aggression. We are talking about the existential event in the history of Ukraine. Of course, we are right now trying to do our utmost to consolidate the position of our European partners, first of all, and our Euro-Atlantic partners as well.
And that anxiety about the instability that Donald Trump has brought to the political equation could be felt amongst the Ukrainians living here in Spain.
Yeah, of course, it's too difficult to understand that Donald Trump is attacking Ukrainian president, the Ukrainian identity like that. It's too difficult. But I hope that it's a big game. He is not dictator. Vladimir Zelensky is not dictator. It's funny, really, when Donald Trump says this. It's not true, because he is not. We have too much opposition politics in Ukraine. Democratic people who think critically, they have minds, they understand that it's not true.
Of course, we want peace. We want peace. After 3 years, after 2 years, we want peace before the war. We are not enemy people, but we want peace with our condition, with our land.
Many of the Ukrainians I spoke to here have become more pessimistic about how this war will be resolved since Donald Trump muddied the waters with his intervention. But while they're concerned about the political outcome, many have been warmed and touched by the ongoing support they've received from local communities here in Spain. The unveiling of this sculpture right behind me is a testimony to that affection. Ashish Sharma, DW, Torrejón de Ardoz.
In parts of eastern Ukraine that are now under Russian occupation, the authorities have repressed religious minorities and essentially banned religious activities that don't adhere to the Russian Orthodox Church. It's the same kind of policy the Kremlin pursues at home. In recent years, Russia has jailed hundreds of Jehovah's Witnesses, a Christian group, under charges of extremism. Now, persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Europe is actually nothing new. The Nazis sent Jehovah's Witnesses to concentration camps where many perished. As journalist Levi Bridges reports, the mistreatment of Jehovah's Witnesses often signals the beginning of wider repressions in a society.
Early one morning a couple years ago, Tatiana Pike heard a loud knock at the door of her apartment in Moscow. Pike says she opened up the door and saw a large group of policemen wearing masks and holding guns. They just barged into her home, where her 2 children and husband were still sleeping. She says she tried to reason with the officers. We're just people of faith, she told them. There are children here. But the officers came in anyway and arrested her husband. Pike says that morning was the last time she touched her husband. He's been in jail for the last 4 years. In Russia, these arrests normally happen in private homes, away from the public eye, but they're not a secret. Russian police usually film the arrests, with the footage often airing on the news. In some cases, the police even rip the doors of witnesses' apartments right off the hinges. According to witnesses I spoke with, the persecution started slowly. Jehovah's Witnesses have lived in Russia for more than a century. When the Soviet Union fell, Russians were able to practice religion more openly, and the number of Jehovah's Witnesses quickly grew to more than 150,000 members. But under President Putin, the government allied itself with the Russian Orthodox Church, to the extent that the Council of Europe now regards it as, quote, an ideological extension of Vladimir Putin's regime. Russian authorities have never given a concrete explanation about why so many witnesses have been jailed. What we do know is that Jehovah's Witnesses believe in nonviolence and refuse to participate in war. Witnesses have long faced persecution in Russia, but tension with the authorities increased back in 2014, just after Russia invaded Crimea. Dennis Christensen is a Danish citizen who was serving back then with a congregation of witnesses in Russia.
Strange people was coming to our assemblies. They were taking videos, and sometimes police came to our conventions also. At that time, we could see that there has been a change, but we could not understand why.
Eventually, Christensen and others learned they were being surveilled. But at the time, they weren't really that concerned because freedom of religion is enshrined in Russia's constitution.
We were totally convinced that we have
the law on our side. And I was the same.
Things eventually escalated a couple of years later, in 2017, when Russia officially labeled Jehovah's Witnesses as an extremist organization. That summer, armed riot police showed up at a meeting Christensen attended with other witnesses.
They collected all our phones, all our tablets, the computers.
The officers recorded a video of what happened next. In the footage, police are yelling at a congregation of mostly women and children. The officers arrested Christensen that day. He became the first witness in Russia to be charged with extremism. The authorities held him in pre-trial detention for almost 2 years before he was sentenced.
I do not agree with this judgment. This is a big mistake.
In a video, bystanders clap outside the courthouse where Christensen was sentenced as the officers lead him away.
Today will be a day where Russia will defend their religious freedom.
In the video, Christensen says he hopes that Russia will start to defend religious freedom.
I wanted to send a signal to the whole earth about what is going on here in Russia. I was maybe thinking that somehow it would help. But actually, if you see the situation right now, it hasn't helped a lot.
Christensen was released from jail after finishing his sentence. He's now back home in Denmark. But since his jailing, the situation for other witnesses in Russia has only deteriorated. Jared Lopes is a spokesman for Jehovah's Witnesses in New York.
The courts in Russia have been increasingly punishing the witnesses with longer and harsher sentences. They initially targeted men, and now they widen their net to arrest women, the elderly, and even the infirmed.
I talked to a witness in Siberia whose husband is living in jail with a degenerative bone disease. He relies on other prisoners for help just getting dressed or bathing. The European Court of Human Rights has ordered Russia to revoke its labeling of Jehovah's Witnesses as extremist and to release those currently held in jail. But the arrests continue. The Russian government didn't respond to my request to comment on the issue. President Putin has claimed not to know about the prosecutions of witnesses. More recently, Russia has also used extremism laws to target groups perceived as against Russia's war in Ukraine. Journalists, activists, and opposition politicians in Russia have also been jailed under vague charges of extremism. Jared Lopes says the treatment of witnesses can be seen as a cautionary tale.
Jehovah's Witnesses really are a bellwether for the state of religious freedom, not just in Russia, but even in other countries, because it's been observed that a lot of times, because Jehovah's Witnesses are peaceful and we don't respond back with protests, we are the first to be attacked in a country. And we've seen countries don't stop with Jehovah's Witnesses.
And while those held in prison endure great hardship, their family members on the outside also struggle. Tatiana Pike, the witness in Moscow, says there are other difficulties besides the separation. She says it's really difficult to raise a family by yourself with only one income. Experiences like hers serve as a harsh warning for others in Russia that if you go against the regime in any way, then your loved ones could also suffer. Levi Bridges, DW.
There's a piece of graffiti at a train stop here in Bonn which says something like, "Guard against the beginnings." How are Jehovah's Witnesses treated in your society? You might want to keep an eye on that. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. This is Inside Europe. The court of Bosnia and Herzegovina has found the Bosnian-Serb leader Milorad Dodik guilty of ignoring the rulings of the country's ultimate authority, the International High Representative. Mr. Dodik's response has been to label the verdict nonsense and launch a fresh attack on Bosnia's national institutions. Our correspondent in the Balkans is Guy Delaunay.
1
year in prison and a 6-year ban on holding elected office. That's the penalty facing Milorad Dodik after his conviction at the court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the president of the country's majority Serb region seemed unfazed by the verdict as he addressed a rally in Republika Srpska's de facto capital, Banja Luka.
There is no reason to worry. I'm used to handling even tougher things. So I will handle this as well. What matters to me is that you are here and that you support me. That will always be important to me.
But this wasn't a case of a defeated politician taking solace from supporters. Instead, Mr. Dodik gave every impression of welcoming the guilty verdict. The court convicted him of ignoring the rulings of Bosnia's ultimate authority, International High Representative Christian Schmidt. Mr. Dodik has refused to recognise Mr. Schmidt's legitimacy, and he's been pushing for Republika Srpska's withdrawal from Bosnia's national institutions. Now, it seems that fight is going to intensify.
They messed up badly with what they did in Sarajevo. They are totally naive. I have to tell you that we have been waiting for this as a reason for political action. That is a reaction. Today, you no longer have the Bosnia and Herzegovina that you imagined.
What Mr. Dodik proposes, in essence, is to roll the country back to 1995. That's when the Dayton Peace Agreement ended Bosnia's ruinous conflict. It split the country on ethnic grounds into two so-called entities with weak national institutions. It was never supposed to stay that way, and over the years, centralised institutions have developed, including armed forces and the judiciary. High Representative Christian Schmidt has made it clear that neither he nor Bosnia's international supporters will allow that to be rolled back.
The international community remains vigilant. The Dayton Order and state institutions remain protected and have to be respected. Bosnia and Herzegovina is not negotiable.
In fact, Mr. Dodik has already triggered efforts to withdraw Republika Srpska from Bosnia's national institutions. He's even ordered prosecutors to investigate officials from the court which convicted him. But there's a school of thought that these bold moves mask weakness. Mr. Dodik has held positions of power since 1998, but he's never delivered on his promises of prosperity, and he's now subject to US and UK sanctions for corruption and endangering Bosnia's integrity.
People in the Republika Srpska are deeply, deeply disillusioned, in particular with the economic situation.
Toby Fogel is the co-founder of the Democratization Policy Council think tank.
Dodik is a besieged leader. He will find it very difficult to maintain power. He's running out of cash. There's widespread disillusionment with his rule. So I would think that he has a very troubled career ahead of him, even if this verdict isn't upheld on appeal or isn't actually implemented.
None of this will be much comfort to the long-suffering people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Tens of thousands of them leave every year because they can't see a future in a country run by ethno-nationalists like Mr. Dodik. And despite his court conviction, he's not going anywhere for the moment. Guy Delaunay, DW, Ljubljana.
And that's it for today. This programme was produced by me, Kate Laycock, with help from Sam Baker and sound engineer Jürgen Kuhn. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn.